Good afternoon, everyone. There are a lot of you here today in the audience and even more of you joining us online. Welcome. My name is Jen Roberts. I'm an assistant director with the Cyber Statecraft initiative at the Atlanta Council, where I focus on issues pertaining to the proliferation of offensive cyber capabilities, including spyware. We are coming to you live from the 12th annual Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge here at American University, where students over the course of the next 2 days will be dealing with some of the very issues that we're going to be discussing with in this panel. For the AU students in the room, I am a School of International Service alumni, so one day you can be up here moderating a panel, and trust me, Cyber 912 definitely gives you the policy briefing skills to be able to do that. A few housekeeping items before we get started. The first half of this panel will be a moderated Q&A, followed by questions from the audience. If you are joining us online, please do populate your questions into the Ask AC function. And if you are joining us in the room today, there is a podium right there where you, when the time is right, can stand up and ask your questions. We're hoping to get to a lot today. So why exactly are we talking about spyware today? For the past 3 decades or more, companies have been selling these services to governments across the world. In fact, just this week, the U.S. intelligence community briefed Congress that over 74 countries have procured these capabilities, some of which have used them to suppress human rights. Just last month in the UK, there was a process called Pall Mall, where over 30 governments, civil society organizations, and universities met to discuss the proliferation of spyware. Thank you again so much for being with us today, and a special thanks to the panelists. If you could go down the line and introduce yourselves to our audience, that would be great, and then I'll ask my first question.
Excellent. Is this actually working? Yes, wow. I'm Rose Jackson. I'm the director of the Democracy and Tech Initiative at the Atlanta Council, which sits within the Digital Forensic Research Lab alongside our colleagues at the Cyber Statecraft initiative. So also just saying huge kudos for this massive undertaking today, and excited to be here.
So everyone can hear me. Oh, that's great. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ingrid Dickinson. I am a security policy manager at Meta. I lead our cyber espionage portfolio, which means that I work on things like APT groups and also what we call surveillance for hire, inclusive of spyware vendors. And what this means is basically that I work with our internal investigative teams who work on taking down cyber espionage networks, as well as communicating with various external stakeholders about the work that we're doing. And very excited to be on this panel and to hear what everyone has to say today.
Checking, can you hear me? All right. I'm Kirsten Hazelrig. I work with the MITRE Corporation, which is a federally funded, we administer federally funded research and development centers. I am a policy lead, and I specialize in the effects, threats, and policy around cyber surveillance technology.
Hello, checking. Great. My name is Monica Ruiz. I'm a senior government affairs manager within Microsoft's digital diplomacy team, and I lead my team's work on what we call cyber mercenaries, which encompasses this issue that we're going to talk about today, which is spyware. Thank you for having me, and congrats to everyone who organized the Cyber 912 Challenge. Look forward to it.
Awesome. Let's dive right in. So much of this debate about spyware in the policy world orbits around some few key terms. Like the word spyware itself. And I realize that these terms are not universally agreed upon, so I'm curious down the line if you each could define what spyware is.
Wait, just because I sat first, I now have to take this. That's strategic error on
Poor
my
life
part.
choices.
Yeah, I clearly. I'll combine it with a little bit. I come from the democracy and human rights world, and so I think, years and years and years ago, we were starting to first see companies come into, particularly on the African continent, to offer solutions to governments. And so, for example, in Zimbabwe, an Israeli company came in and said, we can help you with your voter rolls, digitizing those and having more control over what that's going to look like. You can imagine the ways in which an authoritarian regime led by Mugabe then used that digitized service and built off it into now some of the much more sophisticated tools that they have to keep track of people. But I think I like to remind people of some of those origins, both in terms of the industry's growth and initial use, in that some of the stuff that we're now talking about in the United States over concerns that these tools are being used to target American intelligence officials and as an actual threat to national security started and were innovated for the purpose of harming human rights activists or restricting democracy. And so, you know, the spyware term then can actually mean quite a bit, but I'm going to pass on to others for a much better answer.
Thanks, Rose. So I wanted to start by providing a little bit of context on Meta's work and involvement in this space and kind of how we view this issue. So Meta has actually been reporting on what we call surveillance for hire since 2021. And since then, we've released 3 separate reports on the surveillance for hire industry and their indiscriminate targeting of people across the internet, as well as what we do and have been doing to try to protect our users from these kinds of issues. We actually just released a report back in February that focused on this, and I'm happy to dig in on that as we go through this panel. But basically, we reported on 8 different surveillance for hire vendors that we took down from our platform last quarter, including 4 based in Italy, 2 in Spain, and 2 in the UAE. We talked a little bit about the targeting that we're seeing from them, and also you'll note a lot of vendors based out of Europe, which is interesting. So reported on that, talked a little bit about what we call post-disruption analysis. So what happens when we disrupt or remove people from our platform when they're violating our policies, and how we've seen that impact how they're adapting to our detection systems over time. And then we also provided some policy recommendations targeted towards the tech industry, towards the financial industry, and various governments. We've been really happy to see that many others in the tech industry, as well as, of course, civil society orgs, have done really great reporting over the last few years on this issue. So we feel like we've been able to kind of collectively raise our defenses against these kind of vendors. However, we've been pushing for a whole of society approach to deal with this, because Meta only has certain levers that we can pull and limited visibility on this issue. So all of that being said, jumping back to the definitions issue, I think the best thing that we can provide here is how we view this, which is from what we call a surveillance for hire perspective. And we use that term because how we see this play out on our platforms is within something we call the surveillance attack chain. So that's made up of reconnaissance, engagement, and exploitation. Reconnaissance being like the intelligence collection, basically collecting information on people on our platforms. Engagement, which is social engineering, like backstopping of accounts, basically being appealing to targets. And then exploitation, which is the actual delivery of malware and compromise of a user's account. So we see these things in different phases, different vendors engage in different aspects of the kill chain. So I think that that is kind of like my best offering in terms of our definition of this, and spyware we sort of lump into that last exploitation phase. But I will let others dig into the nitty-gritty of spyware.
All right, and I have to say, I read all of your reports. Excellent work that you guys are doing there. So I would concur with a lot of the generalized ideas that you guys are all saying. I usually group those all under cyber surveillance. So understanding how people interact with the digital world, how records and information goes into the digital world, and then how that's exploited for intelligence or operational purposes. That would be things, a wide swath of things, telemetry data, vehicle, IoT, the voter registration rolls, anything, smart cities. All of that I group under cyber surveillance. And then for spyware, I use the U.S. statutory definition, which is an end-to-end product that's sold, and it is an intrusion in someone's phone that allows them to track geolocation, to intercept communications. A very, very narrow scope that may be integrated with an array of different analytic and surveillance products.
So I'll share my definition of spyware, but then I'll talk a little bit about how Microsoft thinks about this issue. So spyware I see as a type of malware that allows remote unauthorized access to specific data. But moving away from that, Microsoft looks at this particular issue as something we call cyber mercenaries. So we look at the actors and the marketplace more broadly. And the way we define that is a set of companies or at times individuals who develop offensive cyber capabilities to allow clients, at times governments, access to mobile devices, computers, servers, and the like for profit. And so the reason that we look at the issue area in terms of cyber mercenaries, actors, and market is because we think that encompasses more of the issue area that we're trying to cover, at least from an industry perspective. I wanted to double down on Ingrid's point about this being a collaborative, but also a multi-stakeholder challenge. For us, it's been it's been essential to collaborate and partner with different industry players in this particular issue. In fact, we were fortunate to be able to work with Meta, Cisco, and Trend Micro to develop a set of principles aimed at limiting the cyber mercenary market. But also, there's a lot of work that governments have been doing, which I know we'll get into it, Jen, but also civil society organizations have been focusing on this issue for some time. So I appreciate the framing in terms of starting with definitions, because I think there's different players that have different definitions of it. But I also wanted to acknowledge the different angle that we take at this particular issue.
So much for that, Monica and everyone. I heard a few words there, again, that I'd like to dig into. Ingrid, you described this as a surveillance for hire industry, and Monica, you described it as a marketplace. What other actors besides vendors exist in this market, and what are their roles of proliferating these capabilities?
I can take a stab at that one. So obviously there are a wide variety of actors involved in this market. I think two that maybe I wanted to touch on today were investors, as well as other companies within this market that are sort of fitting into the supply chain. I think with investors, obviously, as with any company, spyware vendors need outside investment much of the time to basically build their capabilities. And we believe that investors have a responsibility to make sure that the companies they're investing in are not committing human rights abuses. So this is an area that Meta in our recent report actually provided some suggestions for the financial industry to try to mitigate their potential to be involved in something like human rights abuses. In this case, we really think that investors would do well to kind of adopt responsible investment practices and to make sure that the firms that they're investing in have some sort of human rights due diligence going on. And I think that jumping to basically other companies that fit into this supply chain, this is an area that we have seen in our investigations examples of this. For instance, we've seen spyware vendors acquire smaller vendors that help them build out their surveillance attack chain. And we've also seen instances where spyware vendors have engaged companies with relevant expertise, for example, pen testing or forensics, to pretty much help them and make sure that their exploits are working as expected. So these are just some people that I feel like they don't necessarily get enough attention at the moment. It's starting to be talked about more. But they are involved kind of in the proliferation of these capabilities and are part of the problem allowing these human rights abuses to keep occurring.
And I would tie into these with the entire supply chain of exploit brokers, vulnerability brokers, the whole how these things are made, as well as how these operations are enabled and how these companies are run. Because it's not just a technology that's plopped in the middle of nowhere. There's an entire infrastructure around these. It's how people procure things. There's services involved in the mercenary effort to help people execute them. There's whole for-hire groups that if you don't even know how to target somebody, they will go in and they will identify, be able to target, do their reconnaissance and humanting, and then actually enable those exploits. So it's a full-service organization.
Yeah, I think also acknowledging that depending on where you're coming from in the assessment or questions, you're either very focused on nation states that are making use of the technology or non-state actors. But the point is, it can be literally anyone. And I think, I get to play the role of, I don't have to approve anything that I say, so I get to be slightly spicy. But, underpinning a lot of this is the reality that the United States certainly was building its own capacity to use digital tools to fulfill its mission in intelligence and security systems. And that there certainly was a commercial market that popped up because other countries were like, I want to do that. I also would like to be able to see what's happening on systems. And sometimes that's an uncomfortable thing to kind of keep at bay. But in that context, we often talk about, right, like in a government system, you're looking at permissions and laws and regulations and rules, frameworks for review and accountability. That doesn't exist necessarily in a commercial space when we're talking about this. Or if you're thinking about the sort of regulations that tech companies are navigating, they are not looking at these sorts of questions of accountability and end use. And so I think we're at an interesting moment writ large, and it's useful to see when you're asking questions about who fits into this and what are we talking about in the kind of broader spectrum of spyware, is that this does also tie into a bigger moment in technology where the reality of the fact that the commercial sphere of tech and the government sphere of tech are the same thing. And I think we've had an interest, particularly in the United States, for many, many years to try and keep those conversations as separate as possible because they're a little uncomfortable. And because we have these, significant judicial systems
and processes in place, certainly after the Snowden disclosures, which someone here pointed out to me, many of you may not actually know, and that scares me in their different roles. So actually raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about with Snowden. Cool. It's a useful frame, though, because it was a moment that the U.S. government had to contend with having built up a bunch of capabilities behind the curtain of classification. What's the right balance? Put a bunch of systems in place to try and make sure that we were still abiding by the Constitution. The commercial sector does not have those regulations. Our government, many governments around the world, then go to that commercial sector to purchase what they need. And that has implications across the full spectrum of tech issues that we think about, and certainly in the spyware space. But just naming that those things connect, even so on. Well, if we're going to go down into the drive or the government driver of the capability, we know you have to look at the 90s and market there's when you're going to digital infrastructure, and Korea and Europe, Russia, everyone had their own equivalent. They drove the market, had regulation, and they go forward also into. We started understanding to go in your office.
Director Ray put it, and so. Yes, the government did drive a lot of these things because there are so many very legitimate law enforcement, national security uses of them. But these are tools, and now we have to figure out, okay, we made tools that do cool things, we made tools that do good things. How to make the tools not do bad things? And that is a conversation I think we're going to continue to say, not just how our governments use it, but across the world, other governments, individuals, criminal groups, all of those can and have abused many forms of surveillance technologies.
And I think that's what particularly poses security risks, right? Like certainly, like Rose mentioned at the outset, there are human rights violations that have surfaced in terms of different investigations that have been reported across different civil society orgs. But the mere fact that there is an incentive, a commercial incentive to monetize existing vulnerabilities and then make them available to governments that don't have the capabilities to develop them in-house by themselves creates this very weird dynamic in terms of certainly the human rights violations, but also the security implications of not reporting on these vulnerabilities. And from at least an industry perspective, that's concerning because we want to be very proactive and know about what security vulnerabilities exist to then remediate them right away. So there's also an incentives issue across the stakeholder question you asked.
All of you have sort of touched upon this going back in history to sort of understand now. There's been a lot of policy with the Pall Mall process last month and Summit of Democracy just around the corner where last year we had an executive order come out around in the US as well as a joint statement with a bunch of countries signatory to sort of limit the harms of this spyware space. So I'm curious why this momentum now? What has changed in the past year or 2 years that has led to this being sort of more at the forefront of a policy discussion, and where can we sort of see this going in the next couple of months to a year?
I think it's a combination of factors, right? I think you're seeing increased targeting of different types of individuals, certainly government officials. And so it was interesting to see how the US government released an executive order last year leading up to the Summit of Democracy that essentially prohibited the use of commercial spyware if it were to pose a national security risk or violate human rights. And so that was a very, I would say, key step in the right direction in terms of starting to define, well, what are the uses of these technologies, and certainly from a US perspective, that was very monumental. Also on the sidelines of the Summit for Democracy last year, there was a joint pledge in terms of how countries use these commercial tools and technologies. I think you called out the Pall Mall process. I know this is something led by the British and French governments, but they're also looking at this particular issue area. And what was revealing to me about the Pall Mall process is that they're looking at the market, right? They're also looking at use, but also they're looking at the market base. And then lastly, one thing I wanted to flag as a key development is last week during the open-ended working group, which is a first committee process within the UN that looks at responsible state behavior online, international cyber norms. The chair of the open-ended working group asked states to think about the potential of a new norm for limiting the expansion of this market or informing how states think about and use these tools. And so it's interesting to see that you're seeing a lot of a focus at the domestic level across different governments, but now you're also starting to see a trickle to international forums like the UN. So it's, I think there's a lot that's happened that's led up to this point, and it's very positive that governments are now actively talking about it.
I think, Monica, you hinted at the beginning that this is, actually everyone said, this is like, to solve the problem requires everyone involved, it's multi-stakeholder, it's collaborative. You know, I think the reason partially that we're having these conversations right now is there are major exposés done by journalists and a really incredible network of independent journalists reporting on shocking allegations, particularly around Pegasus, of the systemic targeting of journalists around the world, and as well as the use of some of these same technologies to enable the eventual extremely violent murder of Khashoggi. And people were horrified because it was tying together what feels like sometimes a really technical or technocratic conversation and showing you in stark terms the human costs and reality of what it means when you allow these systems to operate without asking questions. And so I think that pushed it into a space where there was perhaps more political will or even demand to have to start addressing something that often people don't really want to talk about, right? It's if you think about some of the people that are using it, and again, to the point on the fact that many governments, democratic governments, have built capabilities that look similar within democratic systems of control, it's not always a comfortable conversation, and the people that are using those tools are accustomed to not having to have public conversations. So this was thrust into the limelight. People wanted to figure out something to do, and genuine credit to the Biden administration for putting immense work into a really hard question, which got the entirety of the US government on board with this frame. One thing that Monica emphasized, I actually want to really double down on, it's incredible that this came from the intelligence community, saying we've seen evidence that these tools are hurtful to our national security. They are targeting American officials who have sensitive information, and we can't have that. And they are being used all over the world against the things we believe in and against the people that would be able to operate their own governments and countries aligned with human rights and democracy. And by tying those together, I actually think it's strategic because of the thing I was talking about before. A lot of this starts with targeting the most vulnerable in society, and that means violations of human rights. It eventually comes in through a system to hit everyone. But the fact that they created that framework is something we can build on, and they put real work into it. On top of that, they worked with the Freedom Online Coalition that they were chairing for the first time ever, a network of democratic countries working on issues of internet freedom and human rights online, and they came together on certain common surveillance principles. So as governments, how do we manage ourselves in using these tools responsibly? I think it's okay to say that we expect then at the summit in South Korea next week to see some announcements of additional countries joining into the statement that Monica referenced, and continued work. And it's been genuinely wonderful to see. I think sometimes there's a tendency for these kinds of things to be a giant statement and then not a lot of action. But over the last year, there's been, you know, the Pall Mall process means another country picked up the question, took an angle of it, and dug into it in a truly multi-stakeholder way. And we're seeing the US continue that process in South Korea, and that's real. That's really incredible.
Just to quickly add to that, I think civil society has been ringing the bell on this issue for years, though, kind of like you said, right? Like we're starting to see a lot of government action, but organizations like the Atlantic Council, Amnesty International, Citizen Lab, Cyber Peace Institute, I mean, they've been reporting on human rights abuses of these tools for a very long time. And so just wanted to give a shout out to what's been taking place and what now that looks like and how it's evolved.
Well, and at the risk of overstating, also credit to Facebook. If you had not released the reports that you released, if you had not come forward with what you were seeing and joined that conversation, I don't think that the political will would have been there for the administration to take the steps it was taking. For civil society, for journalists, and industry to be saying, oh God, and having real evidence and information made it a lot easier for the people on the inside who wanted to address a problem to do that. And I think that's not an easy thing, so genuine credit for getting that done.
Thank you, Rose. Yeah, absolutely, double tapping pretty much everything everyone has said. Like, huge shout out to civil society and independent researchers. I think that's where this really came into the limelight and got a lot of public scrutiny. And I think it is unfortunate that oftentimes with something this technical, you need to see the human impact. And I think that probably is something that has really driven home, like, there needs to be, like, we need change. So, not to, I don't want to say that, like, industry were the ones that did that, but I think that there has been some really great collaboration between different people in this space, including industry, including civil society. And then I agree. I think it's been great to see the U.S. government and some other governments begin to pick up some momentum here, and I hope that drives home into some more serious action.
It truly takes a village with the multitude of stakeholders in this discussion. Before I ask my panelists the last question, this is a good time to submit your questions online, or please queue up at the podium if you have any questions that you would like answered. We ended on a really good note there about this approach has been getting a lot of attention in U.S. government and international governments. As sort of a concluding note, what would be one piece of policy action that you would like to see the U.S. government or international governments sort of take in this space over the next year or two?
I'm forcing the last first now since I had to do it on the first one. Or
I will
second
I
to
will
last,
step up.
please.
Yeah, I'll step up.
I'll go after.
So my personal opinion on what would be a highly impactful thing is to establish norms of use. What do we actually need to think about? Due diligence, not just for how governments use them, but also what do we expect out of these companies that are providing these services? What kind of background checks do we think they need to do? What do they need to understand is a risk or not risk? Because there are companies out there that are honestly trying to sell law enforcement tools in a ethical way, and they look for guidance. It's not like they don't have human rights specialists on their teams necessarily. So what do we say they need to do, and what do we need to put out there as, say, either regulation or just voluntary guidances or import-export controls, any of those things, so that we can at least control the way these things are proliferating and spreading, and understanding what that is, and allowing a clear bifurcation of legitimate people who are trying to do their best and the fly-by-night shady companies that they're not even attempting to do the right thing.
So what comes to mind for me is this has been a very gray market for a very long time. And so in terms of further defining it, I'm thinking about the adoption of procurement practices, transparent procurement practice. How do governments think about this? What are the different criteria that they think about when they procure certain tools and services? In addition to that is the disclosure of contractual relationships with different types of companies that develop these tools. And so any means by which we can create more transparency into this market area and identify not only the tools, but the governments or the clients for these tools, I think would be a positive step.
We'll just keep switching it up. So I think that, as we've talked about, the U.S. has actually taken some great action as of recently, including things like the U.S. executive order, as well as the recent announcement of visa restrictions. So I think that there are certainly areas that the U.S. could work on, including things like transparency, human rights due diligence requirements, and legal remediations for people that have been targeted by spyware.
However, we certainly, because we've been seeing so much EU activity in our investigation, think that this is an area where there is momentum, but there's not much that's solidly being done yet. So I think one of our big recommendations there is that the EU reconsider, as well as other countries, because the EU is specifically concerned applying pre-existing data protection regulations to these companies, because they're applied to Meta, they're applied to the other companies. But spyware vendors, even though they're accessing and moving around people's data, don't actually really deal with these regulations. So I think that would really help, obviously, make sure that they're practicing better data privacy practices in general, but also potentially force some better transparency and some stronger vetting of the clients that they're selling to, as well as potentially accountability mechanisms for those clients. I think that there are a number of other things, and not to sound like a kind of sales pitching our recent report, but we did list a bunch more recommendations for government and that as well, but I'll wait time. Sure. Right.
But strong review, Monica, you still like that transparency call out, which is just being there, like, we don't, like, democratic government should have to say, like, yes, we're using these things, here's what I'm using. And there are terms of any contractual agreement that require this company to conduct itself in certain ways, right? As well as using the tool of extremely profitable government contracts to say, if you want my money, you have to behave in certain ways elsewhere. And that's kind of a shorthand a little bit of what EO was trying to do. It was trying to say, like, go ahead, go do what you want to do elsewhere in the world, but then I'm not buying. That's what it's doing. So leveraging more of the market power that governments have, I think, is important. I think, though, the subnational level is this kind of deeply troubling space in the United States and elsewhere, but it speaks a little bit to what you were getting at in terms of, companies don't have the right expertise. You're like rural Montana police department that decided they needed to buy surveillance tech because they heard it was cool and get pitched by 12 ridiculous fly-by-night vendors who do terrible things, certainly do not have a human rights principle, they do not have civil liberties protections, they don't understand what they're engaging in. And so I think there's a role in this international conversation to also contemplate what it means to set norms and capacity for those at subnational levels around the world to also be playing their role, and for us to have a better sense of how that works and thinking about those.
Thank you so much, everyone. Please join me in a round of applause for We're going to be taking questions now, so if you have one, please stand up and go ahead and introduce yourself before asking questions to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Hello. Thank you. Hi there. I'm a sophomore at Duke studying computer engineering. Really appreciate you all being here. So it sounds like this executive order is very much, you can go continue with your business, but if you're doing these bad things, then we won't buy from you. But that sounds like it won't solve the problem of spyware getting in the hands of malign actors of governments that are doing these human rights violations. It sounds more like, I'm thinking of the trade war with China, where we're just sort of splitting the economy, and maybe those spyware vendors will still exist, but they'll just work with the bad actors as they were, and then you'll have a separate industry for us, or the West, or whatever we want to say. How do you view that necessarily actually being beneficial to the world? And am I misinterpreting the goal of this executive order?
Well, I can go. My opinion is that the executive order was specifically tailored to control where U.S. government dollars go. We're not subsidizing abuse. Okay. It's not. There's nothing in it that intends to really control where these companies make their money outside the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. So yes, understanding what the different U.S. government mechanisms are in place, what each one's trying to do, I think would be critical there, because there are efforts going on across the government, which I know you can both speak to far better than I. But understanding each surgically where each one has the ability to control different items.
So two things that I think are interesting in this. Number one, all of these are like layering stepwise. Executive orders are inherently limited towards what the executive branch can do. But what's fascinating is, I served in the State Department under the Obama administration. And I remember walking in, and I'd spent a bunch of time working in various African countries, and it really pissed me off that I was seeing so many of these like horrific companies running around doing really terrible things and no one cared. And the reason it made me even angrier is that they were almost entirely European, American, or Israeli. Not a single one of them was Chinese or from an authoritarian country. Every single one of the worst ones were sitting in democracies. And so I think part of why I love this a little bit is we're not the best in the United States at addressing our own domestic shortcomings on these issues, let's say. We don't have a privacy law, which is a national security threat and dumb. But there we are. But this is something that was saying, okay, we are going to at least ensure we're not generating this. And we're going to work in partnership with other democracies to say, get your house in order. And then we can start trying to create norms, which when you walk into the international system, very rarely do you have an expectation that a policy position that you take is going to inherently change other people's behavior, so much as at least set a standard and be able to have something to point to. So I think of this very much as a step, and an important and notable step, but certainly not addressing the grand scheme of things.
My name's Cooper. I'm a senior at Utah Valley University. Recently, news did break that the NSO was ordered to give Meta the source code for Pegasus, specifically and other spyware. We've talked a lot about the government placing restrictions on themselves in terms of what they are and are not able to do. Do you think there is any room for the government to put regulations or sanctions on these companies, these commercial companies that we really don't have control over, to try to regulate this use of spyware? And something that we're often asked is, what authority do we have here?
You don't have to.
Well, I think just to confirm I understand the question, are you proposing regulating tech platforms or regulating the spyware companies themselves?
Regulating, to a certain extent, both the use of the spyware.
Sure. So on that front, and this may be my own ignorance, I don't personally know of many examples in which companies like Meta have used spyware themselves. I will say that I don't know that we need more regulation in this space, though I don't want to make a definitive statement on that either way. Just to throw it out there, Meta does a lot of work in this area actually to combat these kinds of actors, including what we call our threat disruptions model. So we take these networks down, we track recidivism to make sure they don't come back on our platforms, we do industry, government, and researcher sharing and alert people who may have been targeted by them, and then a lot of public attribution and reporting. So on that front, I do think that there's a lot of good work already being done by industry in this space. In terms of spyware vendors themselves, I do think that there's absolutely room for regulation there. I do think things like human rights due diligence and better transparency should absolutely be thought about in terms of further regulations. So there's a lot of work that could be done there. And I think, as we've talked about, this is kind of a slow roll process. So I'm hoping that over time, we'll see more governments actually engaging in creating or applying pre-existing regulations to those companies.
If I may, a few thoughts come to mind. So first, the Treasury Department released sanctions against specific spyware companies and named individuals, which I think was very positive in part because this market is a bit of a whack-a-mole. You identify an organization, either an industry partner does, and what they do, they shut their doors, then they move to another location and set up with the same people, same everything, different name. And so you're starting to see governments sanction certain companies that are developing offensive cyber capabilities and naming individuals that are actively involved in this. In terms of the EO, just linking to the previous question, my understanding in this, and I'll defer to to my colleagues here, it prohibits government use of commercial spyware that poses a national security risk and has violated human rights. So again, I think it's good to start thinking about government advancements, but also how they're defining these issues. A coalition of companies that's called the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. Meta is also a member of that. And there's a four-part mission for the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which is no hackback, collective defense, advancing cyber capacity and awareness, and contributing to capabilities. And I think that in part informs how we, at least as Microsoft, think about our our contributions to the space, right? Like we have community standards. We're very, very transparent in terms of what we do and don't do, and how we can contribute to identifying these groups and taking them down and collaborating with other industry partners. So I'm with Ingrid here in terms of like additional regulation to industry. I don't know if that's the route. I think additional regulation to certain types of industry partners that are actively developing offensive capabilities, that is needed, but that's where I land.
Hi, I'm Walker Evans. I'm a graduate student at American. I really appreciated how you all brought up the EU's role in the zero-day and spyware market because I feel it's very often understated. These spyware companies very often take advantage of low export control countries like Greece, Cyprus, Lithuania, and the EU has tried to regulate this stuff. I think in last year, June, there was a really big push, but these countries still get away with it because of their weaker export controls. Is there any like non-policy solutions or anything that's outside the realm of EU just legislation that could be used to address these issues in like Greece, Cyprus?
Yeah, I mean, I think you were alluding to this, but you can create the rules that create consequences.
Your question. And I think we're in the phase where the value of people doing the research to be able to document where the problems are, publicize that, provide sufficient documentation to the government officials that have the abilities. The mechanism that Monica was referring to means that the United States government could choose to go after many of the people that you're talking about. But they need the information to be able to do that. And I know sometimes it feels like if the U.S. government says it's going to do something, then it's like, great, we can go after everyone. But if you think about this kind of like the sanctions regime, there's a massive bolstering of U.S. capacity to do sanctions and targeted sanctions because of the Iran deal and a bunch of other things that had absolutely nothing to do with this. There's one little part of the Treasury Department called OFAC that is supposed to build these files. On human rights issues, we would often partner with organizations to have them build better files on people we wanted to sanction to give to OFAC so that we could then convince OFAC to go after those people. So now it's kind of like you got a tool, you have a thing you can use. Now it's more of that information and more of that reporting information from industry, putting it into forms that can be used to leverage the tools that we have while you're moving forward to the regulatory changes. On that note, though, we are somewhat limited in what we expect the U.S. government to do about a global market. Some of which these countries aren't interacting, or these companies are not interacting in the United States. They're not selling in the United States. U.S. dollars are going to them. They may all respectively comply with the export laws of their country. So, and if that country locks them down, if there's laws, they will move to a different country. And so it is whack-a-mole, not just against the companies themselves, but where they're located and where they staff and who's working. So what the U.S. government can do in this space, from a sanctions perspective, you have to, that is a tool of meaning. What the EU itself can do in this space is a tool, I think. None of these are saying, do this one office, this one department, just work harder, you could fix it. That will never be the answer. Thank you.
Hi, we have an online question from Michael Luth. He asks, how can we insure against these kinds of intrusions? Can insurance companies or governments provide any cover for situations where no one has done anything wrong, but criminals are taking lots of money from honest citizens through the use of spyware?
I'm not going to be insuring. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with insurance.
Insurance covers for loss. For that, I know that there are a lot of these companies that are targeting things like mergers and acquisitions. But from my viewpoint, I have not seen anybody file for my loss, and so I'll be insurance balance. I have not. I mean, the two things that come to mind is first, still have to be sure the society is doing, particularly access now has fault line, that the victim put up a spyware for the target can access all You also have sit in the lab, oftentimes help scan people's phones, mobile devices, if they perceive the evidence of this. And the things, the first that they will capture and do that back to off is build one awareness of how someone can be more cyber secure online. But also that is collaborating with different partners to figure out, this is an actor that we're monitoring, how can we collaborate to either expose them, take them down, share our research, and so hopefully that informs what every individual user can better protect themselves. So that's basically not right. Yeah, I think echoing what you said a little, do not have much experience on insurance in this area. It sounds like a good idea, but I think just highlighting a really big issue there, which is that a lot of type targets of spyware don't have great recourse in terms of many things like financial assistance, things like legal remediation. So it's an area that I think a lot of work needs to be done in, and people probably need to do some research on reporting on this, and I think better regulation in that space would be helpful.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Herrera, coming from ASU. I'm studying computer science, and I would like to ask the question of applications starting to be blended in as potential spyware. As we've known, TikTok has been under the suspicion of it being used as spyware towards U.S. citizens and other citizens across the world. And I would like to ask the question of whether or not NIST compliance or NIST regulations could potentially solve an issue like this, or if there's a much more higher effectiveness or degree of enforcing this type of regulation.
You're hitting on something near and dear to my heart. The answer is absent federal privacy protections in this country, or rules around data brokers, or rules around transparency and reporting from companies about the kind of ways that their products are being used. There's not a lot that we can do in that space. That's not a TikTok problem. A lot of what you're talking about is completely and perfectly legal in this country to be able to use an app in ways that would look a lot like surveillance. I do want to be clear, though, that we're talking about something very different here, in that a lot of the more sophisticated tools that have been developed at this point can be loaded onto somebody's device without their knowledge, increasingly without their action. So previously the expectation was you might accidentally click something. It doesn't even necessarily require that anymore. Years ago, Finn Fisher made it so that if you got on a Wi-Fi network at a hotel and it was loaded there, that they then had access to your device and everything that we're doing. That's very different than using what you have in pretty lax laws to be able to collect large amounts of information on people. It's not necessarily taking over their phone. But I do think you're hitting on, and this is what I was looking at before, we can't pretend that these are separate conversations. The way that our commercial technology space is regulated and governed has implications for where the incentives are for how people are going to build companies that make money. And those things will eventually make their way into government use. They will make their way into these sorts of things. So it is part of a security conversation, but a little bit different than some of the core cyber conversation.
No, I agree completely. It's the cost, the industry, and the technology around mass surveillance, what you're talking about, is completely different than really surgical, high-end target surveillance. And though we can do so much of it, there's actually a huge, the industry view of how we're using that kind of really random data for mass surveillance. There's a much broader range of legitimate uses out there. People like real estate firms use that kind of data to track foot traffic and what lives there in target malls. So there's a very large industry discussion that needs to be had around that, or what we believe in privacy advocate for privacy law. But that conversation is much more touched just because of every beautiful part of the industry that can't touch that's touched, as opposed to we're having spyware. There's only one or two uses for that. They know what they're doing. Like it's not, we're not having this really raw tool use. Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Let's defend the question before we wrap.
First of all, thank you so much for excellent presentation thus far. My question is regarding, Greg Malcolm and you, Coach. My question is regarding the level of visibility that some of these private spyware vendors actually have into what is being done with their platform. I've noticed that the claims that they make sometimes fluctuate depending on what's convenient for them, where they claim that they have a high level of oversight. In certain cases, in other cases, they say, hey, we can't actually see what our clients are doing with this. So I'm curious, any insight that you have on that, the truth of those claims, and two, if in the process of developing kind of an international framework for legitimate companies that could provide this to governments for use against terrorism, what would kind of be the level of visibility we would want these companies to have? What level of oversight should they have into the activities that their clients are using their platforms for?
Well, for sure that. It's actually our State Department publishes recommendations for surveillance technologies that these points out to war government. And it includes technical controls, like being able to remote shut off economic licenses or values, or being able to lock things down to remote, or being able to use a geo-open source to use. So that work is starting to be done. With regards to what can be for companies, there's the things I have not personally tactically assessed every single out there, so they're only bringing up capabilities that is experiment. I think some of these companies part of it and not.
You're hitting at a really important conversation that's actually live right now as the U.S. government decides, after the executive order on artificial intelligence, decided to create a national security memorandum on how that would be used within government systems for military intelligence purposes. The exact same question. What is it that you can request of private companies, the expectation of end use monitoring? And the answers right now are pretty crap, honestly. Both in terms of having an actual technical answer for how companies that would be selling do that, and then a lot of unease within the government and civil society in figuring out you want to ask for something that you know is just 100% not possible and then going to be completely blown by, and at the same time not kind of setting the bar too low as to what it is that you expect in it, in the influence that you have in creating a market. So I would encourage you to keep digging into that question and doing that not just on the spyware piece, but more broadly. What is the responsible balance? The one thing is, you do normally have with these companies, if they get a contract with the government, they have requirements of being able to maintain classified security clearances themselves. So that, like, the idea that they can't know because it's too sensitive, that's a little bit, let's just say no. But this is where it actually, one thing that we haven't mentioned here is, there's the concept of human rights and responsibilities tends to be state-based. And so it says that you're only asking things of states. There's also an entire field of business and human rights law and approaches focused on how do you set good standards within companies and get companies to monetarily sign on to what are their responsibilities in these spaces, particularly on human rights. The Wassenaar principles or something you could look at there. I think it's also an interesting question. You never have to choose one or the other. What is it you're asking governments to do in requesting things of the companies they make use of? What is it you're asking companies to say that they're going to do? Which, the two folks we have on stage are a great example of that. Voluntary shared agreements on standards because they don't want to be next to a bunch of very bad companies doing bad things. But good question.
Can I have one last thing? The terrorist support companies actually after 32, so it's very fitting that when you asked, I used a sheet published a Walker article on a recent cyber risk that in China called ISU, and it was very revealing in terms of what is the internal nature of the work, what were the employees dealing with. So I'm just, to that question, I just want to give a shout out to someone who's published my curation.
Thank you.
Well, hi, and thank you for your time. I'm a sad. Just to round out this line of questioning, actually, the export control mentioned that you make Rose is a good call. This space is very complex. Technologically, industry, just the stakeholders alone. There tend to be a lot of people talking past each other. So to kind of end this all in one nice little bow, if there is a bone that you have to pick, or like a correction or a nitpick that you would like to kind of say to the space, what would it be?
There's the airing of grievances.
Yes,
I feel like I'd be a minute. One of my pet peeves I will go into, use the word spyware every single thing. Like, just because a collection rate doesn't make it spyware, there are so many people that it makes conversation be very imprecise. And it makes all policy discussion impossible because everyone's talking back and up, but you get that makes it good. After that relationship, there's a lot of terminology that's used that depending on who's using it, it's defined differently, and so it reinforces what I was talking about everybody sees from past one another. And so maybe finding a way to identify a shared definition for different terminology within this issue that we call items. Yeah, not to be original. For considering that one, I mean, I think that is part of the problem sometimes. We each have our own terminology, and I understand why they're created, but I think that there are definitely values. So when talking about these things, I appreciate I attended a roundtable run by Land Council earlier this week to talk about some job sessions. And so it's nice to see that there's work in that space. And I think often that these things, that's part of the process, kind of centralizing these job sessions. So I think that would be a big one for us. Probably must just go by. Actually, keep thinking my prep drill.
And I'll insert some moderator's prerogative here and end up my own bone to take. I could put this temperature is that we've talked a lot here today about it being a market. I think that we're starting to see some policy action towards treating it like a market. Let's keep that momentum going. And with that, thank you so much to our panelists and all of you here today. Yeah.